In the first 5 weeks of the COVID-19 vaccine rollout, over 10 million people across the US received at least a single dose. And despite fears that ranged from how quickly the vaccine was developed to full-on conspiracy theories, there has only been a handful of people who've experienced side effects, mainly limited to severe allergic reactions. But the pharmaceutical companies that made the vaccines don't have to worry about these outliers, at least not legally. They're protected by what's become an American tradition of shielding vaccine makers from lawsuits.
So originally in the 1980s, there were some lawsuits from parents whose children had seizures following the wholesale DPT vaccine, the wholesale pertussis vaccine. Pharmaceutical companies essentially did a litigative risk analysis and said, well, if we're going to lose these suits occasionally, then we're going to have to increase the price of vaccines. And Congress stepped in and said, you can't raise the prices as high. And the pharmaceutical companies had essentially the ultimate trump card and said, well, then we won't make them. The National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program came into effect around 1989. And what it did was it said, if you were injured by a vaccine that's on the childhood vaccination schedule, you had to go through this program first. You couldn't sue a pharmaceutical company.
The Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, or VICP, is funded by a small tax on each vaccine. It covers most of the legal fees that come with litigation and allows for appeals. And it's worked well, paying out 7 in 10 claims it's received.
The VICP is an important tool to ensure that pharmaceutical companies can at once, compensate those who are injured by their vaccines fairly, while also ensuring that they're not tied up in litigation. So the VICP will say, you received this particular vaccine, you had this particular documented side effect, therefore the schedule dictates that your compensation shall be a certain amount of money. And this obviously expedites the opportunity for compensation for the individual rather than having to sue the producer of the vaccine, and also does a good job of incentivizing the production of vaccines because the profit margin of vaccines is much smaller than that of other pharmaceuticals.
In 2005, the Bush administration tried to prepare for future pandemics by creating the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program, which would cover a different type of vaccine.
Think of it as like a one-off vaccine. The swine flu or the H1N1 vaccine, influenza that came out in 2009, but it wasn't widely administered. The anthrax vaccine would be considered as part of this and things like that. So it was not meant for vaccines that were widely distributed to the American public.
The COVID-19 vaccine is supposed to be as widely distributed as possible, which should mean it's covered by the VICP, but so far it's not. Since it was developed as a response to a pandemic, it's covered under the Countermeasures Program, which is much less transparent, not as well funded, and only has 4 employees, among other issues.
The first one to start at is the statute of limitations. You have 3 years in our court to file a claim. In the Countermeasures Program, you only have 1 year to file a claim. 2, you have no right to counsel in the Countermeasures Program. It's not a legal proceeding. The Countermeasures Program has no right of appeal if you lose. The H1N1 vaccine, when it was administered in 2009, it came under the Countermeasures Program. The overwhelming majority of those claims were denied. I think of all the hundreds of claims that were filed, 29 were compensated. Pharma is protected in both categories. It allows the development of these vaccines in both cases, both the Vaccine Injured Court and the Countermeasures Program. But the real difference is whether or not you're going to compensate people that are injured. And that's where the VICP is far better.
President Trump's Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar, worked to keep this vaccine under the Countermeasures Program, which is bad news for anyone who experiences serious side effects. But the cost of that decision is likely much, much greater than just a dollar amount.
I think when you have something like the Countermeasures Program, which is primarily, across the board denials of claims, that builds that type of distrust and it builds that hesitancy to take vaccines and things like that. But we want people to be, absolutely confident that if you are injured by this vaccine, if for some reason you're that rare person that's injured by the COVID-19 vaccine, we're going to take care of you. That's our job. That's our moral responsibility as a society.